Hey everyone, it's Mark here. Today I wanted to talk about the ADF system in the A-18C Hornet. Now the ADF stands for Automatic Direction Finder, and the ADF equipment is used to tune the frequency of a navigation beacon and then display the bearing information to that beacon on the HSI screen of your Hornet. Now before I begin, I want to cover a common pitfall that newer pilots can often find themselves falling into with the ADF. So the ADF is found on the UFC panel right here. It's this three-way switch. Uh, it has an option for COM 1, off, or COM 2. Now what happens when we turn on the ADF to whichever radio we want to tune on, we hear static until we've tuned in a proper beacon frequency. However, if we wanted to turn that off by clicking it back to the off position, you'll notice that the static persists. Now this is not a bug or an issue with the simulation. This is proper behavior in a Hornet. Now what's happening here is because we've tuned the ADF on, it has disabled the squelch for the radio that we've turned it on for. So in order to get rid of the static, we need to click on the radio that we tuned it to. So in this case, COM 1. We click on the knob, and then you'll notice here on the squelch option, typically there'll be a colon to the left of the squelch letters, which is not present. And that's because the ADF system has disabled it. So if we click the button to the left, the colons return and the static sound has disappeared. So what the squelch does is it acts as a noise gate on the radio and filters out any low signal strength or low strength signal coming into the radio. But the ADF system can use even low strength signal to direction find, so it disables the squelch so that it can get maximum information coming into the system. So, as I said before, as long as your ADF system is turned back off, you can go to the radio that you had it on for, re-enable the squelch, and the noise should disappear. Now moving on, to actually use the ADF system, it's important to have the radio frequency for the beacon that you're trying to navigate to ready to go, even before you take off. Typically in DCS, we can find this frequency in the briefing screen before the mission starts, or alternatively, if available, in the F10 map. So for today's lesson, we'll go into the F10 map, and we're trying to navigate to Krasnodar Peshkovsky. And more specifically, we are trying to home in on this beacon. Now this hexagonal shaped symbol is a VOR beacon, and its frequency is 115.80 megahertz. To the right of that, we see these two letters. This is the Morse code designation for this beacon, KN. Now there are other types of beacons available. For example, we have this NDB, or non-directional beacon, and it's at a frequency of 312.00 kilohertz. Now, kilohertz frequency ranges aren't available on the Hornet's radios. We can't tune them, so unfortunately we cannot use these types of beacons to navigate in the Hornet. We can only use these hexagonal VOR, or very high frequency omnidirectional radar range beacons, to navigate with ADF. There are another version of these, so it's the hexagon shape, but it's enclosed in a square, and the square indicates that the beacon also contains distance measuring equipment. Now, unfortunately, again, the Hornet cannot utilize this distance measuring equipment with the ADF system, so we are unable to determine any range information with ADF in the Hornet. So let's go back to the cockpit now. and we'll tune in the frequency for the beacon that we're trying to reach. So I typically use COM1 for all my voice communications when navigating with ADF. So channel 2 will be our navigation radio. So we'll click the dial to bring that radio's information up on the UFC. We'll hit clear to clear out the frequency currently entered, and we'll enter our new frequency, 115800, and press enter. Now if we listen, we should hear the Morse code for that beacon come through our radio. And there it is. So it's important to note the Hornet doesn't use any navigational data sent on the frequency. We hear the Morse code sent, but there's no data being sent through this transmission that gives the Hornet any information about the direction. The direction is found purely by kind of honing in on the signals and the strength of the signal to determine what direction it's in. So now that we have this frequency tuned, we need to tell the ADF system which radio that we're using. So in this case, we use COM2, so we want to set the ADF to COM2. So we left click, and now the ADF is using COM2 to try to find a direction or bearing for us. In order to see the information that the ADF is getting, we need to bring up the HSI screen. So we can press the menu button on our left EDI twice, and then on the HSI button that appears, click that. And this brings up the HSI compass rose. Now you can see on the compass rose, there is a symbol here. It's a circle. That's the ADF marker. So that is the bearing that the ADF equipment on the Hornet has determined for the beacon that we have tuned in the radio. So now we can turn our aircraft to that bearing and continue on to that beacon. What's important to note is that the ADF system, as the aircraft turns, is subject to what's called a dip error. And essentially all that is as the aircraft turns, the angle of the aircraft, or the angle of the ADF equipment on the aircraft to the beacon has changed slightly, and so you'll see a little bit of drift in the beacon. So it's important to, or not important necessarily, but what I like to do is determine or memorize the heading that it's giving you before you begin your turn. Turn directly to that heading and stop, because the marker will drift, and if you just follow it, you'll end up kind of overturning, and you'll have to correct. It's not a big deal, but it's just a little more efficient to memorize the bearing before you turn to the bearing that you've memorized, and then stop, and then correct afterwards if needed. So going a step further, what I usually do is actually use my heading bug and set it to the bearing of the ADF marker, and then I'll click on my autopilot on the UFC, so the AP button, and then I'll click on the HSEL or heading select button to turn on the heading select, and the aircraft will turn to the bearing that we've set. And you can see there's just a slight bit of drift as we turn. Part of that is just the bearing actually changes because we're taking time to turn and as we travel closer, but part of it is that dip error that I spoke of. So now we're on course to our beacon, and we can maintain this course and we will arrive at our destination. It's also important to note that this system can be affected by line of sight. So if a building or a mountain were to get in the way, it can cause a problem with the signal. Typically in that case, if I know there should be a signal coming through, I'll usually climb altitude just to make sure it's not a mountain or a hill that's in our way. But otherwise the system is pretty foolproof and works quite well. It's very simple and very easy to use. So as we go, the Morse code signal will continue, and that could be a little distracting. So luckily both radios, COM1 and COM2, are equipped with volume buttons or volume knobs. So we can turn down the volume on COM2 to decrease that Morse code signal. What's important to note here is if we turn the volume all the way off, you'll see on the HSI compass rose, our ADF marker has disappeared. It does need some volume in order to direction find on the signal. So we just turn it up even just one notch. It's enough for it to get direction finding information. So the other thing to note is that there is no distance information, and we talked about that earlier on the map. But just to continue with that, the ADF doesn't give us any distance. The only rudimentary tools we have is that as we get closer to the signal source, the ADF marker becomes a little bit more sensitive. So if we're off course to the left or the right, you'll see the marker will kind of move more to one side or the other as we get closer to the beacon. And then of course, as we fly over the beacon, you'll see the marker move to the reciprocal heading. If you're flying past or beside the beacon, you'll see it move quickly, kind of past on the compass rose. But otherwise, very little information provided for distance measuring. And that more or less covers navigating with the ADF system. There is one more thing that I wanted to show. So let's say, well, basically the ADF system is, all it's doing is taking a radio signal and determining at which bearing that signal is the strongest. So you can use any tunable radio frequency or any signal that's on a tunable radio frequency to use the ADF equipment on and find the direction. So what I'm going to do, just to give you an example of that, is I'm going to tune on my COM2 the AWACS aircraft. So I'll click on the COM2 radio, bring it up on the UFC, clear out the data, and I know that my AWACS is on frequency 251,000. I'll hit enter. Now you'll see we have the volume down, but now we just hear static and the marker on our compass rose is gone. That's because there's nothing transmitting on this frequency. But if I go on my radio and actually contact the AWACS,
Dark Star, Colt, 1-1, Alpha check from Bull's picture. Colt, 1-1, Dark Star, Bullseye, 140, for 190.
You can see as Dark Star transmits their reply, the ADF picks up that radio signal and is able to determine the direction that Dark Star is relative to us, or the bearing relative to us. So that's an interesting tool that you might be able to use along, you can use it on your Wingman or any other tunable radio source. And that concludes everything I wanted to discuss with the ADF system on the Hornet. So I'm going to sign off here. I'll let the flight continue until we reach our destination, which is coming up shortly. I just wanted to say thank you for watching and tuning in. If you have any questions or comments or corrections to the information that I provided in this lesson, please leave a comment below. And otherwise, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Take care.